September 10, 1944. South China Sea, 03 hours. Aboard the cruiser Ioba, Admiral Teizo Matsunaga stood on the bridge, listening to the steady churn of engines as his task force steamed toward the Philippines. The night was clear, the sea calm. His staff officers assured him that American submarines were rare, dangerous only near Hawaii or Australia. The Imperial Navy still believed the Pacific was too vast for the enemy to patrol effectively. Yet when the first torpedo slammed into the cruiser Miyoko's stern, lifting it from the water in a geyser of fire, Matsunaga's illusion shattered. Within minutes, another explosion rocked the tanker Kachidoki Maru. Then another struck the destroyer Shikinami. The Japanese admiral gripped the railing, stunned. How could the Americans be here, in the middle of the ocean, in the dead of night? His answer came moments later, when lookouts spotted the wake of another torpedo streaking toward his flagship. The Americans were not in one place. They were everywhere. At the start of the war, Japanese naval officers had dismissed U.S. submarines as secondary weapons. Carriers and battleships were considered the true instruments of victory. Submarines, they believed, were scouts or nuisances, not decisive tools. The irony is that America's submarine force, only 6% of the Navy, would sink more than half of Japan's merchant fleet and one-third of its warships, including 8 aircraft carriers and the giant battleship Congo. By 1945, Japanese admirals realized that submarines had strangled their empire as effectively as any bombing campaign. The shock came not from a single battle, but from the relentlessness of the campaign. Japan entered the war with a merchant fleet of 6 million tons. These ships carried oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Burma, resources Japan needed to fight. By early 1945, 4 million tons of that fleet lay at the bottom of the sea. America's submarines had destroyed it. By war's end, Japan had less than 1.5 million tons left, much of it in small, useless coastal vessels. Factories starved of oil, cities of food, armies of ammunition. The empire that had spread across the Pacific became an island fortress, slowly suffocated. The mathematics behind this shock were staggering. At peak, the U.S. Navy operated fewer than 300 submarines, yet they patrolled the largest ocean on Earth. Thanks to new tactics, long-range designs, and radar, those submarines made the Pacific feel small. By 1944, American submarines were sinking merchant ships faster than Japan could build them. In 1943 alone, they destroyed 1.5 million tons of shipping. In 1944, the number rose to nearly 3 million tons. Japan could not replace even a fraction of it. One lesser-known fact: early in the war, American submarines were hampered by defective torpedoes. The Mark 14 ran too deep, often failed to explode, or detonated prematurely. For 18 months, frustrated commanders fired salvo after salvo to no effect. Japanese officers mocked the dud fish. Yet once the defects were fixed in 1943, the impact was immediate and catastrophic. In that single year, submarine sinkings doubled. By 1944, Japanese captains no longer laughed. They dreaded the unseen hunter waiting beneath the waves. Technology played its part. American submarines carried the SJ radar set, capable of detecting ships at night from 10 miles away. Japanese escorts, often without radar, never saw them coming. Submarines could surface under cover of darkness, track convoys, and position themselves with mathematical precision. Once torpedoes slammed home, radar allowed them to slip away, diving before enemy lookouts even knew their direction. Japanese officers, relying on visual spotting, were bewildered. "The enemy always knows where we are," one destroyer captain complained. "He attacks in fog, in rain, at night. He does not need the sun." The psychological toll grew. Survivors of torpedoed convoys told of seeing ship after ship erupt in flames, sometimes 10 in a single night. Merchant captains began refusing to sail. Crews deserted in droves. By 1944, so many tankers had been sunk that Japan transported oil in 55-gallon drums lashed to open barges. Submarine commanders recorded targets so pitiful they almost hesitated to fire. Sampans, fishing junks, even wooden sailboats carrying coal. Yet each sinking further strangled the empire. Japanese admirals, trained to think in terms of battleships and decisive fleet actions, could not grasp how a small force was dismantling their war machine. At staff meetings, reports arrived daily of more ships lost. The tanker Azusa Maru sunk with 10,000 tons of aviation fuel. The transport Lisbon Maru, carrying 700 soldiers, gone. The heavy cruiser Otago, flagship of Admiral Kurita, destroyed in minutes by USS Darter. By late 1944, the losses were so severe that fleets could not sail for lack of fuel. The proud battleship Yamato, largest warship in the world, spent most of her career anchored in harbor, too precious and too fuel-hungry to risk. When she finally sailed on her suicide mission to Okinawa in April 1945, she had only enough fuel for a one-way trip. Another little-known fact: American submarines were devastating not just because of torpedoes, but because of intelligence. Thanks to the breaking of the Japanese Naval Code JN-25, U.S. commanders often knew convoy routes before ships even left port. Submarine patrols positioned themselves like hunters at watering holes, waiting where prey would pass. Japanese officers, unaware their codes were compromised, blamed luck. Some even suspected traitors. The truth was worse. Every message they sent was read by their enemy. The shock extended to warships. In 1944, USS Albacore sank the carrier Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier, with a single torpedo. The same year, USS Kavala destroyed the carrier Shokaku. The submarine USS Archerfish sank the giant carrier Shinano, displacing 72,000 tons, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. The Shinano had sailed only 10 days after commissioning with no air group aboard, yet a single American submarine consigned her to the depths. Japanese admirals, who had once considered carriers the core of their power, realized that none were safe. The industrial arithmetic behind this campaign was ruthless. America's submarines consumed enormous quantities of fuel, torpedoes, and spare parts, but the U.S. supply system delivered. Bases at Pearl Harbor, Fremantle in Australia, and later Guam and Saipan kept submarines operating continuously. When one boat returned from patrol, another left. Japanese attempts to deploy anti-submarine escorts were pitiful. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had perfected wolfpack tactics of its own, 3 or more submarines coordinating attacks on convoys. Japanese convoys often dissolved into chaos, ships scattering in panic, only to be picked off one by one. For Japanese sailors, the terror was constant. Convoys sailed with lookouts, straining every horizon. Depth charges boomed into empty water for reassurance. Yet the submarines still struck. Survivors clung to wreckage, watching the wakes of more torpedoes streaking toward other ships. They wrote of nightmares of steel fish lurking below, invisible and unstoppable. Admiral Shigeru Fukudome admitted after the war, "We had no answer. Our Navy was defeated not in battle, but in silence, beneath the waves." Even civilian Japan felt the impact. By 1945, food shortages were severe. Rice rations shrank, coal deliveries faltered, and cities froze in winter. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Mothers fed children millet or acorns. all because submarines had cut the sea lanes. Entire islands of the empire, Manchuria, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, were cut off from the home islands. The Japanese High Command, obsessed with decisive battle, had ignored the lifelines of logistics. American submarines severed those lifelines link by link. One final statistic reveals the magnitude. Out of 6,200 Japanese merchant ships, American submarines sank more than 100. Out of 350 major warships, they sank 201. The cost was high: 52 U.S. submarines lost, 3,500 submariners killed. But the exchange crippled Japan beyond recovery. By 1945, Japanese admirals who had once mocked submarines were begging for countermeasures they did not possess. Destroyers were too few, sonar too primitive, radar too scarce. The ocean, once Japan's empire highway, had become a graveyard. When surrender came, many Japanese officers confessed their greatest shock was not the atomic bomb or the carrier raids, but the submarines. They had fought against shadows, never knowing when the next torpedo would strike. Admiral Soemu Toyoda summarized it best. "We fought bravely, but we starved. Submarines were the unseen enemy. They destroyed our war without ever showing themselves." For Admiral Matsunaga, that night in 1944 was unforgettable. His flagship survived, limping back to port. But half his convoy never made it. As he walked the pier in Manila days later, watching oil burn on the water, he muttered, "The Americans are not here or there. They are everywhere." He was right. America's submarines, fewer than 300 in number, had made the Pacific into a cage. For the Empire of Japan, strangled from beneath the waves, there was no escape.